Shadows in the morning light. The air inside Pinewood Cafe was thick with the comforting hum of life, a symphony of clinking coffee cups, rustling newspapers, and murmured conversations. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world, where regulars came for a moment of peace and a slice of pie served warm by a waitress who remembered your name. Morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, painting the wooden tables in golden hues. But today, amidst the warmth and familiarity, there was an undercurrent of unease. At a corner booth, her back pressed firmly against the wall, Elena Carter sat nursing a cup of black coffee. She was a woman who knew how to go unnoticed, her worn leather jacket and faded jeans helping her blend into the cafe's rustic charm. But her posture gave her away. Shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. This wasn't a woman idly sipping coffee. This was someone waiting, watching, calculating. The middle-aged waitress, whose name tag read Martha, approached with a fresh pot of coffee. Her kind eyes crinkled in a faint smile as she gestured to Elena's half-empty cup. "You waiting on someone, sweetheart?" Elena returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just my dad," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying an edge of weariness. Martha poured the coffee and lingered for a moment, as though sensing the tension that clung to Elena like a shadow. But before she could say more, the familiar rumble of engines broke through the quiet rhythm of the cafe. The low, guttural roar of motorcycles grew louder, shaking the walls and drawing every gaze toward the windows. Elena's hand tightened around her mug as 5 motorcycles pulled into the gravel lot outside. The riders dismounted with the confidence of men who believed they owned every room they entered. Crimson vultures' patches adorned their leather jackets, emblems of skulls wreathed in crimson flames, symbols of chaos and fear. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a predator's grin, was Derek Hayes, and his reputation preceded him. The cafe's door swung open, the cheerful jingle of the bell an absurd contrast to the tension that followed them inside. Derek's sharp gaze swept the room as he swaggered in, his boots heavy against the tile floor. The other patrons fell silent, their breakfasts forgotten as they watched the group take over the space with jeers and booming laughter. "Look at this place," Derek sneered, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Small-town charm, huh? What a dump." His men laughed as they took the booth nearest to Elena's. One of them glanced her way, nudging Derek with a smirk. Derek turned, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Elena kept her gaze on her coffee, ignoring him, but Derek wasn't one to be ignored. He leaned against her booth, invading her space with a grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Hey, sweetheart, this seat taken?" The room held its breath. Martha froze mid-step, her hand gripping the coffee pot tightly. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Elena's fingers tightened around her mug, but she didn't look up. Derek's grin widened, mistaking her silence for submission. "I said—" "She heard you," came a calm, steady voice from the doorway. Every head in the cafe turned toward the entrance. Standing there was Frank Carter, a tall man with broad shoulders and an unshakable presence. His face, weathered by time and hardship, was partially hidden by a pair of dark sunglasses. In his hand, he held a white cane that moved in smooth, deliberate arcs across the floor. Frank's voice, though calm, carried an authority that silenced the room. He tapped his cane once against the tile and began walking toward Elena's booth, his movements confident despite his blindness. Elena's tense expression softened as she stood to guide her father to the seat across from her. "Morning, Dad," she said, her voice lighter now. "Morning, sweetheart," Frank replied, his tone even but warm. He folded his cane carefully and rested it on the table. Derek's grin faltered as he watched the interaction, his arrogance momentarily shaken. "Well, isn't this cute?" he said, forcing a chuckle. "Daddy's here to save the day." Frank tilted his head slightly toward the sound of Derek's voice, his expression unreadable behind his dark glasses. "I don't know who you are, son," he said evenly, "but I suggest you walk away." The bikers erupted into laughter, their jeers filling the room. One of them clapped Derek on the back. "What's he gonna do? He can't even see you." Derek smirked, emboldened by the support of his crew. He leaned in closer to Frank. "What's the matter, old man? Need your little girl to fight your battles for you?" Elena's jaw tightened, her hand steadying itself on the table. "Leave us alone," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the laughter. Derek ignored her, focusing instead on Frank. "Come on, old man. Show me what you got." Frank's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've fought bigger battles than you'll ever know," he said quietly, his tone carrying a weight that silenced even Derek. "But if you're smart, you'll sit down and enjoy your breakfast before you make a mistake." The room was thick with tension. Martha clutched the coffee pot like a lifeline, and the other patrons sat frozen in their seats, whispering nervously. Derek laughed again, though the sound rang hollow this time. His gaze flicked to Elena, who met his stare without flinching. Suddenly, Elena reached for her phone, her fingers moving with a quiet urgency. She dialed a number, her voice low but steady. "It's me," she said. "I need you here, now." The minutes that followed felt like hours. The bikers, emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences, resumed their crude jokes and loud jeers. Derek returned to his booth, though his glances toward Elena and Frank carried an edge of uncertainty. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the bikers called to Elena, his voice dripping with mockery. "Who'd you call? Your boyfriend, the sheriff." Their laughter was cut short by the distant roar of engines, this time not motorcycles, but the unmistakable hum of SUVs. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the glint of sunlight reflecting off sleek black frames as a line of vehicles pulled into the cafe's gravel lot. Doors opened in unison, and men and women in sharp suits stepped out, their movements precise and purposeful. They weren't police, but their air of authority was undeniable. The cafe door swung open, and a man in his 40s entered, his tailored suit immaculate and his expression cold. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Elena. "Miss Carter," he said, His voice clipped. "Are you all right?" Derek's smirk vanished as confusion and unease spread across his face. "Who the hell are these people?" he muttered. Elena stood slowly, her shoulders squared. "They work for me," she said simply. The room fell silent once more. Derek's bravado melted as he stared at her, struggling to reconcile the unassuming woman before him with the authority she now exuded. "You!" he scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "What are you, some kind of big shot?" Elena's lips curved into a small, cold smile. "Something like that. What would you have done in Elena's shoes? Have you ever had to stand up to someone in a tense situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below." The cafe held its breath as the black SUVs idled outside, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Inside, Elena Carter stood firm, her cold, steady gaze locked on Derek Hayes. The tension in the air was suffocating, the kind that makes every second stretch into eternity. Derek's earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a simmering unease. Around him, his gang fidgeted in their seats, their confidence draining with each passing moment. The man in the suit, now standing by Elena's side, turned his icy gaze to Derek. "Miss Carter doesn't appreciate being harassed," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I suggest you apologize and leave." Derek chuckled, though the sound rang hollow. "Or what?" he sneered, glancing at the suited agents who stood like statues outside the door. "You think a couple of guys in suits scare me?" Elena's jaw tightened, her fingers brushing the edge of the table as she leaned forward. "It's not just a couple of guys," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "It's an entire task force, and trust me, Derek, they're not here to play games." At that moment, Frank Carter, her father, leaned back in his seat, his weathered hands resting on the table. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was commanding. Without raising his voice, he said, "Son, I'd take her advice if I were you. She's not bluffing." Derek's gaze flicked toward Frank, the sight of the blind veteran sitting so calmly, only adding to his frustration. "You really think I'm scared of you?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You can't even see me." Frank tilted his head slightly, his dark glasses reflecting the dim light of the cafe. "You're right. I can't see you," he said evenly. "But I don't need to see to know what kind of man you are. I've dealt with your kind before. Bullies who think fear makes them strong. But fear isn't strength, and it sure as hell doesn't make you untouchable." For a moment, the room was silent. Derek's gang exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. Derek himself seemed torn between lashing out and backing down, his pride and uncertainty warring within him. Elena's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Enough. You've already wasted too much of my time. Apologize and leave, or don't, and deal with the consequences." The air grew heavier, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone in the room. Derek's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. But before he could speak, the man in the suit raised a hand, his tone cold and final. "Miss Carter has given you a choice. I suggest you make the right one." With a muttered curse, Derek shoved his chair back and stormed out of the cafe, his gang reluctantly following behind him. The sound of their motorcycles roaring to life was a bitter reminder of their presence. But as they disappeared down the road, the cafe exhaled a collective sigh of relief. As the tension eased, Elena sank back into her seat, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the moment. Frank reached across the table, his calloused hand finding hers. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her voice was tight. "I'm fine, Dad, but this isn't over." Frank tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" Elena hesitated, glancing at the man in the suit, who gave her a subtle nod. Taking a deep breath, she lowered her voice. "Those bikers, they're not just a gang. They're part of something bigger, something dangerous. We've been tracking them for months, gathering evidence on their connections to a larger network of hate groups, intimidation, violence, trafficking, you name it. And now they've made it personal." Frank's jaw tightened, the lines on his face deepening. "And you didn't think to tell me this sooner? I didn't want to worry you," she admitted, her voice soft. "But now I don't have a choice." The man in the suit cleared his throat. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone professional, "we should leave. There's a lot to discuss, and we don't have much time." Elena stood, her resolve hardening. "Dad, let's go. I'll explain everything on the way." Frank unfolded his cane, his movements deliberate as he stood. "Where are we going?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with curiosity. Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "To finish what they started." The convoy of SUVs wound its way through the outskirts of town, the dense forest closing in around them as they approached their destination. A nondescript warehouse, its dull exterior masking the technological heart of the Horizon Task Force. Inside, the scene was a stark contrast to the outside world. Rows of monitors blinked with data. A hum of voices filled the air, and agents moved with precision, their every step purposeful. Frank paused as they entered, his hand resting on Elena's arm. "What is this place?" "This," Elena said, gesturing to the bustling command center, "is what I've been working on. It's a private task force I built to tackle hate crimes and systemic corruption. We've been operating quietly, gathering evidence, and dismantling groups like Derek's." Frank's face remained neutral, but there was a hint of pride in his voice as he said, "You did all this?" Elena shrugged, though her voice wavered slightly. "After what happened to Mom, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I had to do something." Frank's expression softened, the weight of her words settling between them. But before he could respond, Megan Hill, the team's lead analyst, approached with a tablet in hand. "Elena, we've tracked Derek and his gang back to their clubhouse. It's a biker bar on the edge of town, but it's more than that. It's their base of operations. And they're hosting a meeting tonight with members of their larger network." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Do they know we're on to them?" Megan shook her head. "Doubt it. But we've got a chance to take down not just Derek's crew, but some of the higher-ups in their organization." Frank gripped his cane tightly, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. These people aren't just loudmouths, Elena. They're dangerous. Elena placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. That's why we're not going in blind. No unnecessary risks. Frank hesitated, then nodded. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, she said, though her resolve was written plainly across her face. This ends tonight. What do you think about Elena's decision to confront the Crimson Vultures? Would you take the same risk for justice? Let us know in the comments. The convoy of SUVs came to a stop a mile away from the Iron Skull Tavern, hidden in the shadows of a dense pine forest. The task force moved with precision, their tactical gear blending seamlessly into the night. Overhead, drones buzzed quietly, their infrared cameras feeding live footage to the monitors inside the command van. The tavern was alive with noise, rowdy laughter, clinking glasses, and the roar of motorcycles coming and going. But what lay beneath the surface was far more sinister. Inside the command van, Elena Carter stood over a glowing monitor, her face illuminated by its blue light. Her sharp eyes tracked the movements of Derek Hayes and his crew as they gathered in the bar's dimly lit interior. Around them, unfamiliar faces, other members of the Crimson Vultures network, mingled in hushed conversations. "How many so far?" Elena asked, her voice steady but tinged with tension. Megan Hill, her lead analyst, clicked through the surveillance feeds. 30 on the ground floor, but we've confirmed a basement level. That's where the leadership is meeting. Elena nodded, her jaw tightening. We take them all. No loose ends. Sitting nearby, her father, Frank Carter, tilted his head, his ears tuned to the chatter around him. Though he couldn't see the monitors, he had a sense of the room's tension. "You've got the numbers," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "But don't underestimate them. These people thrive on fear. They'll fight back if cornered." Elena turned to him, her expression softening for a moment. "That's why we're going in with a plan. No unnecessary risks, Dad." Frank nodded, but his grip on his cane tightened. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" Elena asked, meeting his sightless gaze. "Promise me you'll walk out of there," Frank said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I can't lose you, too." For a moment, Elena's confident facade cracked, the weight of his words settling heavily on her shoulders. "I promise," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The task force moved into position, slipping through the forest like shadows. Elena led the charge, her sidearm secure in its holster, her movements precise and deliberate. Frank followed close behind, his cane tapping lightly against the ground, each step measured but unwavering. As they approached the tavern, the noise grew louder, a jarring mix of laughter and shouting that masked the quiet approach of the team. Elena raised a hand, signaling the agents to surround the building. Through her earpiece, she gave the final command. "On my count, 3, 2, 1. The doors burst open, and the task force stormed inside, weapons drawn. "Hands in the air!" Elena shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The room erupted. Some of the bikers froze, their faces pale with shock, while others scrambled for weapons. Derek Hayes stood in the center, his chair toppling over as he leapt to his feet. "What the hell is this?" he roared. Elena stepped forward, her badge gleaming under the flickering lights. "It's over, Derek. You're under arrest." Derek sneered, his fists clenching. "You think you can just walk in here and take us down?" Before Elena could respond, the situation exploded. A biker lunged at one of the agents and chaos erupted. Fists flew, tables overturned, and shouts filled the air. Elena moved with precision, dodging a wild swing and taking down a burly man with a swift kick. The room was a blur of movement, but amidst the chaos one figure stood steady. Frank Carter, despite his blindness, held his ground. He listened carefully to the sounds around him, his sharp instincts guiding his movements. When an attacker charged toward him, Frank sidestepped gracefully, using his cane to trip the man and send him sprawling. Another approached, but Frank's calm demeanor never wavered. "You picked the wrong fight," he muttered, disarming the man with a swift motion. Meanwhile, Elena's focus locked on Derek, who lunged at her with a roar. She sidestepped him easily, slamming him into the wall. "It's over, Derek," she said, her voice cold. "You've already lost." The task force quickly regained control, subduing the remaining bikers and securing the scene. Derek, his face bloodied, was hauled to his feet, his defiance burning in his eyes. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "There's more of us. You'll never stop us all." Elena leaned in, her voice quiet, but filled with steel. "Maybe not, but I'll make damn sure you never hurt anyone again." As Derek was led away, the room fell silent, save for the sound of the task force securing evidence. Elena turned to Frank, who stood amidst the chaos, his expression calm but proud. "You okay, Dad?" she asked. Frank smiled faintly. "I'm fine, sweetheart, but I think I earned that slice of pie you promised me." Elena chuckled softly, the tension easing for the first time that night. "It's on me." Back at the Haven Operations Base, the atmosphere was electric with victory. The evidence gathered from the raid was enough to dismantle the Crimson Vulture's entire network. Elena stood with Megan, reviewing the files that linked the group to other hate organizations across the state. "This is just the beginning," Megan said, her eyes shining with determination. "We've got a lot of work to do." Elena nodded, her resolve unshaken. "Then let's get to it." Weeks later, the Pinewood Cafe was once again a place of quiet comfort. Elena and Frank sat in their usual booth, the sunlight streaming through the windows as they shared a rare moment of peace. Outside, the world continued, but inside, father and daughter basked in the satisfaction of a battle hard won. "Think they'll come back?" Frank asked, sipping his coffee. Elena shook her head. "Not a chance. And if they do, we'll be ready." Frank smiled, lifting his cup. "To resilience." Elena clinked her mug against his, her voice steady and filled with quiet pride. "To justice. Because justice isn't just about the battles we fight. It's about the courage to stand up, even when the odds are against us." What did you think of Elena's journey? Have you ever had to take a stand for what's right? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that courage can change the world. The end.